The blazing sun beat down mercilessly as Victoria Pierce squinted at the distant shimmer of what she hoped was Salida, Colorado, and not another cruel mirage. Her parched lips cracked as she urged her exhausted mare forward, the last drops from her canteen long gone, and the unforgiving summer of 1876 showing no mercy to a woman traveling alone through unfamiliar territory. Victoria had been riding for days, chasing a dream that seemed more foolish with each passing mile. At 24, she had left behind the comforts of St. Louis society to claim the small plot of land her late uncle had bequeathed her, land she'd never seen, but represented her only chance at independence after refusing the marriage her parents had arranged with a man 3 times her age. "Just a little farther, Penny," she whispered to her mare, patting the animal's sweat-slicked neck. The elegant riding habit she'd started her journey in was now filthy and torn, her fair skin reddened by days under the relentless sun. Victoria's vision began to swim, the horizon tilting at an unnatural angle. She tried to reach for her hat, which had slipped from her head, but her arms felt impossibly heavy. The world spun, and Victoria felt herself sliding from the saddle, unable to command her limbs to hold on. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was a plume of dust on the horizon, and the vague outline of a rider approaching at speed. Thomas Yates had been tracking a herd of wild mustangs when he spotted the lone rider swaying in the saddle. As a rancher born and raised in the Colorado Territory, he knew immediately what he was witnessing: a traveler succumbing to the merciless summer heat. He dug his heels into his stallion's flanks, urging the animal into a gallop across the scrubby terrain. He reached the fallen rider just as she toppled from the saddle, her body hitting the dusty ground with a sickening thud. Thomas dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. He was surprised to find a woman, her face flushed an alarming red, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Madam, madam, can you hear me?" Thomas knelt beside her, his calloused fingers checking for a pulse at her wrist. It fluttered beneath his touch, too fast and weak for his liking. Acting quickly, Thomas retrieved his canteen, uncorked it, and gently lifted the woman's head. He poured a small amount of water onto her cracked lips, careful not to give her too much at once. When she didn't respond, he dampened his bandana and placed it on her forehead, then removed his duster and fashioned a makeshift shade to shield her from the sun's punishing rays. "You've got yourself in quite a fix, madam," he murmured, studying her face. Despite the sunburn and dust, he could see she was beautiful and clearly not from these parts. Her clothing, though trail-worn, was of fine quality, and her hands lacked the calluses of a woman used to frontier life. Thomas glanced at her horse, which stood nearby, head hanging low with exhaustion. "Your friend here's about done in too," he said, approaching the mare slowly and offering her water from his hat. The animal drank greedily. He returned to the unconscious woman, debating his options. Salida was still a good 10 miles away, too far to carry her in this heat. His own ranch was closer, about 3 miles back. "Looks like you'll be my guest for a while, madam," he said, though he knew she couldn't hear him. Thomas carefully lifted her onto his horse, mounting behind her and cradling her limp form against his chest. He took up the reins of her mare and, with a click of his tongue, started the journey home. The woman stirred slightly in his arms, her head rolling against his shoulder. Thomas looked down at her face, concerned by the heat he could feel radiating from her skin even through his shirt. "Hang on there," he said softly. "I'll get you someplace cool and safe. Just hold on." Victoria swam through a haze of disjointed dreams of St. Louis parlors and disapproving glances, of her mother's tears when she announced her departure, of endless dusty trails that led nowhere. Occasionally, she would surface to a reality of strong arms, the rhythm of hoofbeats, and a deep voice murmuring reassurances before darkness claimed her again. When she finally clawed her way back to full consciousness, Victoria found herself lying on an unfamiliar bed in a sparsely furnished room. A damp cloth lay across her forehead, and her dusty traveling clothes had been replaced with a simple cotton nightgown. Panic fluttered in her chest as she tried to sit up, only to fall back against the pillows as dizziness overtook her. "Easy now," came a deep voice from the doorway. "You're safe, but you need to rest." Victoria turned her head toward the speaker, a tall man with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. He was dressed simply in a work shirt and denim trousers, his sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms. "Where am I?" Her voice came out as a rasp, her throat painfully dry. The man crossed the room and poured water from a pitcher into a cup, which he carefully held to her lips. "My ranch, about 7 miles outside Salida. I'm Thomas Yates. Found you collapsed on the trail yesterday afternoon." Victoria drank gratefully, the cool water like heaven on her parched throat. "Yesterday. I've been unconscious that long," Thomas nodded, setting the cup aside. "You had a bad case of heatstroke. Another hour out there, and I might not have been having this conversation with you." His expression was serious, but not unkind. "Mind telling me what a lady like yourself was doing riding alone in this heat?" "I'm Victoria Pierce," she replied, struggling to maintain her dignity despite the circumstances. "I was traveling to Salida to claim property left to me by my uncle, William Pierce. I may have underestimated the journey." A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's lips. "That's putting it mildly, Miss Pierce. You're lucky I was tracking that Mustang herd." He hesitated, then added, "A woman helped change your clothes, Mrs. Ramirez, my housekeeper. She's been helping tend to you." Victoria felt a flush of embarrassment at the thought of being so helpless, so dependent on strangers. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Yates. I'm in your debt. Once I'm recovered, I'll compensate you for your trouble and be on my way." Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly. "No trouble at all, but you won't be going anywhere for at least a few days. Heatstroke isn't something to take lightly." He stood and moved toward the door. "Mrs. Ramirez will bring you some broth shortly. Try to rest." After he left, Victoria sank back against the pillows, exhaustion claiming her once more. Her last thought before sleep took her was that Thomas Yates didn't look at all like the rough, uncouth frontiersman she'd been warned about. In fact, despite his plain speech and working man's hands, there was something distinctly gentlemanly about him, something that made her feel safe in this strange place. When Victoria next awoke, an older Mexican woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked black hair was setting a tray on the bedside table. "Ah, you are awake, señorita. Good. I am Elena Ramirez." She helped Victoria sit up against the pillows. "You must eat to regain your strength." The broth was simple but flavorful, and Victoria found herself ravenously hungry. As she ate, Mrs. Ramirez busied herself opening the window to allow a cool evening breeze into the room. "Mr. Yates, he found you just in time," the housekeeper said, clucking her tongue. "Many do not survive such heat. You are fortunate, yes." "Yes," Victoria agreed, setting down her spoon. "Mrs. Ramirez, could you tell me a little about Mr. Yates? What kind of man is he?" Elena's face softened. "Señor Thomas is a good man, fair to his workers, kind to animals. He built this ranch from nothing after the war." She paused, considering her next words. "He keeps to himself mostly. Lost his wife and baby son to fever 5 years ago. Since then he works, he reads his books, but he does not smile much." Victoria felt a pang of sympathy. "That's terribly sad." It was, But life continues, no. Alina took the empty bowl. Now rest. Tomorrow perhaps you will be strong enough to sit on the porch for fresh air. After the housekeeper left, Victoria found herself thinking about Thomas Yates, trying to reconcile the stoic man who had spoken to her with the grieving widower Alina had described. There was depth to him. She realized pain carefully hidden beneath that composed exterior. The following morning, true to Alina's prediction, Victoria felt strong enough to dress in a simple calico dress the housekeeper had provided and venture onto the covered porch. The air was already warm, but nothing like the scorching heat of her ill-fated journey. From her vantage point in a rocking chair, Victoria could see that the Yates ranch was modest but well-maintained. A large barn stood some distance from the main house, with corrals and a bunkhouse beyond. Several men were working with horses in one of the enclosures, and in a nearby field, cattle grazed peacefully. "Good morning, Miss Pierce. You're looking better today." Victoria turned to see Thomas approaching from the direction of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Despite the early hour, he already looked as though he'd put in half a day's work, with perspiration dampening his shirt and dust clinging to his boots. "Good morning, Mr. Yates. Yes, I'm feeling much improved, thanks to your hospitality." She gestured to the view. "You have a lovely property." Thomas tucked the rag into his back pocket and leaned against the porch railing. "It's not much compared to what you're probably used to back east, but it suits me." His expression turned curious. "Tell me about this property you're claiming in Salida. William Pierce, you said." "Old Bill Pierce's place," Victoria nodded. "You knew my uncle." "Everybody around these parts knew Bill," Thomas replied. "Gruff old coot, but fair in his dealings. Kept to himself mostly, had that little place at the edge of town with the apple orchard. Been empty since he passed last winter. Didn't know he had family back east. He and my father were estranged," Victoria explained, looking down at her hands. "I only met Uncle William once when I was a child. I was as surprised as anyone when his lawyer contacted me about the inheritance." Thomas studied her for a moment. "If you don't mind my asking, what brings a lady like yourself out here alone? Surely you could have sent someone to handle the property matters." Victoria's chin lifted slightly. "I came because I wanted a fresh start, Mr. Yates. My situation in St. Louis had become untenable." She didn't elaborate, unwilling to share the humiliation of her broken engagement or her parents' ultimatum. Something in her tone must have conveyed the seriousness of her situation, because Thomas didn't press further. Instead, he nodded and said, "Well, Bill's place isn't grand, but it's solid. Good water source, fertile soil for the orchard. With some care, it could be quite comfortable." "You speak as though you expect me to stay," Victoria said, surprised. A hint of a smile touched Thomas's lips. "Aren't you? You said you wanted a fresh start." "I." Victoria hesitated, realizing she hadn't thought beyond claiming the property. The idea of actually living alone in the Colorado territory suddenly seemed daunting. "I suppose I haven't fully decided." Thomas straightened up from the railing. "Well, no need to decide today. You're welcome to stay here until you're fully recovered and can see the property for yourself." He tipped his hat to her. "I need to get back to work. Alina will see to anything you need." As he walked away, Victoria found herself watching his retreating figure with interest. Thomas Yates was unlike any man she'd met in St. Louis society, straightforward, unpretentious, and seemingly without agenda. Despite the tragedy Alina had mentioned, there was a quiet strength about him that Victoria found oddly comforting. Over the next few days, Victoria's strength returned gradually. She spent mornings on the porch, afternoons helping Alina with simple household tasks, and evenings in the small parlor where Thomas would sometimes join her after supper. Their conversations were tentative at first, but as days passed, they began to share more of themselves. Thomas told her about growing up in Pennsylvania, fighting for the Union in the war and coming west afterward to start anew. He spoke of his late wife, Margaret, with gentle reverence, and of their son who had lived only 2 years. In turn, Victoria shared stories of her childhood in St. Louis, her love of literature, and her dreams of someday writing stories of her own. What she didn't speak of was Franklin Alderson, the 50-year-old business associate of her father who had been so eager to marry her, or the ultimatum her parents had delivered: marry Franklin or be cut off without a penny. When Uncle William's letter had arrived, it had seemed like divine intervention. A week after her arrival at the Yates ranch, Thomas announced at breakfast that he would be taking her to see her uncle's property that day. "If you feel up to it," he added, studying her face for signs of fatigue. "I do," Victoria assured him, excitement and anxiety mingling in her stomach. "I'm eager to see what Uncle William has left me." They set out shortly after breakfast, Victoria riding her recovered mare and Thomas on his sturdy bay gelding. The day was warm but not oppressive, with a gentle breeze that made the journey pleasant. Victoria found herself enjoying the ride, observing the landscape with new appreciation now that she wasn't fighting for survival. "The land changes character with the seasons," Thomas commented as they rode. "It can be harsh, but there's beauty in it too. You just have to learn to see it." Victoria nodded, understanding what he meant. What had seemed like a desolate wasteland during her desperate journey now revealed itself as a landscape of subtle colors and textures, the silver green of sage against the tawny earth, the distant blue of mountains framed against a cloudless sky. They reached Salida by mid-morning. The small town was busier than Victoria had expected, with wooden boardwalks lining the main street and businesses ranging from a general store to a hotel to several saloons. People glanced curiously at them as they rode through, particularly at Victoria. "Town's still growing," Thomas explained. "The railroad's coming through soon, which will change things considerably." He guided them past the town center toward a road that led slightly uphill. "Your uncle's place is just ahead." The property came into view as they crested a small rise, a modest cabin with a covered porch, surrounded by neat rows of apple trees. A small stream ran along one edge of the property, and behind the cabin stood a weathered barn. The setting was peaceful, with the town visible in the distance and mountains forming a dramatic backdrop. "Oh," Victoria breathed, taking it all in. "It's lovely." Thomas dismounted and helped her down from her horse. Bill was particular about his orchard. Those trees produce some of the best apples in the territory. He used to trade them for supplies in town. They walked toward the cabin, and Thomas produced a key. "Sheriff gave this to me when I told him I'd be bringing you by. Your uncle was well respected around here, despite his solitary nature." The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable: a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, a bedroom off to one side, and what appeared to be a study filled with books. A layer of dust covered everything, but Victoria could see that the furnishings were of good quality and the space had been well cared for. "He was quite the reader," Thomas remarked, running a finger along the book spines. "Like his niece, it seems." Victoria smiled, feeling a connection to the uncle she barely remembered. "Yes, it seems we had that in common at least." She moved around the cabin, touching things lightly: the back of a chair, the edge of a table, the spines of books. "I can picture him here." They spent the next hour exploring the property, with Thomas pointing out features Victoria might have missed: the well with its sweet water, the root cellar dug into the hillside, the small workshop attached to the barn. By the time they returned to the cabin, Victoria felt overwhelmed, but in a good way. This place could truly be a home. "What do you think?" Thomas asked as they stood on the porch, looking out over the orchard. "Could you see yourself living here?" Victoria took a deep breath of the clear mountain air. "I believe I could. It would take work, of course. I have much to learn about this kind of life." Thomas nodded, his expression unreadable. The folks in Salida are generally good people. They'd help a newcomer, especially Bill Pierce's niece. He hesitated, then added, "And I'm not far if you need assistance with anything." The offer touched her. "Thank you, Mr. Yates. You've already been kinder than I had any right to expect." "Thomas," he said quietly. "After all this time, you might as well call me Thomas." Victoria smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer day. "Thomas, then, and I'm Victoria." They rode back to town, where Thomas introduced her to key people: the sheriff, the storekeeper, the banker who held her uncle's papers. By the time they finished their business, it was late afternoon, and Thomas suggested they stay for supper at the hotel restaurant before riding back to his ranch. Over a simple but hearty meal, they discussed the practicalities of Victoria moving into her uncle's cabin. "It needs a good cleaning first," she acknowledged, "and I'll need supplies." "I can help with that," Thomas offered. "Some of my ranch hands could ride out with us tomorrow, get the place in order. Elena might come too, help with the indoor work." "You've already done so much," Victoria protested. "I can't impose further." Thomas shook his head. "It's what neighbors do out here. Besides, I promised Bill once that I'd keep an eye on his place if anything happened to him. Consider me keeping my word." As they rode back to the ranch in the fading light, Victoria found herself studying Thomas's profile, wondering at the man who would go to such lengths for a stranger. There was a steadiness to him that drew her, a quiet integrity that stood in stark contrast to the polished manners and hollow promises of the men she'd known in St. Louis. For his part, Thomas was experiencing feelings he'd thought long buried. Since losing Margaret and their son, he'd focused solely on building his ranch, deliberately avoiding entanglements that might lead to more loss. But there was something about Victoria that had breached his carefully constructed defenses: her determination, perhaps, or the way she faced her new circumstances with a blend of trepidation and courage. The following days were a flurry of activity. True to his word, Thomas brought two of his hands and Elena to help prepare the cabin. The men repaired a few loose boards on the porch, checked the roof for leaks, and cleared debris from the yard, while Victoria and Elena scrubbed the interior from top to bottom. By the end of the second day, the cabin was transformed clean, aired out, and ready for habitation. Victoria had used some of her remaining funds to purchase supplies in town, and Thomas had contributed items from his own stores: preserved foods, candles, lamp oil, and other necessities. He'd also arranged for firewood to be delivered and stacked beside the cabin. "I feel as though I'll never be able to repay your kindness," Victoria told him as they stood in the cabin's main room, surveying their work. Thomas shook his head. "No repayment necessary. Just be a good neighbor when someone else needs help someday." The evening before Victoria was to move into the cabin permanently, Elena prepared a special dinner at the ranch. After the meal, Thomas invited Victoria to walk with him, and they strolled toward a small rise that offered a view of the surrounding countryside in the fading light. "I wanted to give you something," Thomas said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small revolver, polished and well-maintained. "It's not much, but a woman living alone should have some protection." Victoria took the weapon gingerly. "I've never fired a gun before." "I can teach you," he offered, his voice gentle. "It's simple enough, and it might make me worry less about you being out there alone." The admission that he worried about her sent a flutter through Victoria's chest. "I would appreciate the lesson," she said, carefully tucking the revolver into her skirt pocket. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I'll miss our conversations," Thomas said finally, his voice low. "It's been pleasant having someone to talk with in the evenings." Victoria glanced up at him, struck by the vulnerability in his expression. "Perhaps we could continue them. I'm not going so very far away." Thomas met her gaze, and something passed between them, an understanding, a possibility. "I'd like that," he said simply. The next morning, Thomas helped Victoria load her few belongings onto a wagon he'd borrowed for the purpose. Elena hugged her tightly, extracting a promise that Victoria would visit often, and pressed a basket of food into her hands. "For your first days," the housekeeper explained, "until you learn to use that stove properly." The journey to the cabin was quiet, both Victoria and Thomas lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Thomas unloaded her trunk and the supplies, carrying everything inside while Victoria arranged things to her liking. "Will you be all right here?" he asked as he prepared to leave, standing awkwardly by the wagon. Victoria nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at her. "I believe so. It's what I came west for, after all independence." Thomas studied her for a moment, then reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm around hers. "If you need anything at all, send word. I can be here quickly." "Thank you, Thomas," she said softly, "for everything." He released her hand reluctantly and climbed onto the wagon. With a final tip of his hat, he drove away, leaving Victoria standing on her porch, watching until the wagon disappeared from view. Alone for the first time in her new home, Victoria took a deep breath and turned to face the cabin. "Well, Uncle William," she said aloud, "it seems it's just you and me now, or your memory at least." The first week on her own was challenging but exhilarating. Victoria learned to manage the wood stove, figured out the best way to draw water from the well, and explored every inch of her property. She discovered her uncle's journal in his study and spent evenings reading his observations about the land, the weather, and the townsfolk, gaining insight into the man she'd barely known. On her third day, a neighbor from a nearby farm visited a friendly woman named Sarah Jenkins, who brought freshly baked bread and offered gardening advice. 2 days later, the general store owner's wife stopped by with preserves and an invitation to the church social the following Sunday. True to his word, Thomas rode out to check on her twice that week. His visits were brief but welcome, and each time he left something useful, a tool she might need, seeds for a vegetable garden, a book he thought she might enjoy. Their conversations flowed easily now, the initial reserve between them giving way to a growing friendship. On Sunday, Victoria attended the church service in Salida, wearing her best dress, one of the few items she'd brought from St. Louis. She felt the curious stares of the townsfolk, but was met with mostly warm greetings, especially once people realized she was Old Bill's niece from back east. Thomas was there, looking unusually formal in a clean shirt and string tie. He sat with her during the service, and afterward introduced her to more people than she could possibly remember. At the social that followed in the churchyard, he stayed near, seemingly aware of her discomfort among so many strangers. "You're doing fine," he murmured as they stood with plates of food. "They're curious, that's all. Not many unmarried ladies from good families move out here alone." Victoria sipped her lemonade, observing the mix of people, ranchers and their families, shopkeepers, miners from the hills, and a few professionals like the town doctor and the school teacher. "It's so different from St. Louis. Everyone knew their place there, stayed within their social circles." Out here, circles are luxury, Thomas replied with a small smile. We need each other too much to stand on ceremony. As summer turned to early fall, Victoria settled into her new life with growing confidence. She kept her uncle's orchard tended with advice from Thomas and neighboring farmers, learned to preserve the abundant apples for winter, and began to feel truly at home in her small cabin. She also started writing in the evenings, filling journals with observations and story ideas, rediscovering a passion that had been discouraged in her previous life. Thomas's visits became a regular part of her routine, sometimes planned, sometimes unexpected. He taught her to use the revolver as promised, showing patience as she learned to aim and fire at targets he set up behind the barn. He helped with repairs around the property and brought news from town when she hadn't been in for a while. For his part, Thomas found himself looking forward to these visits more than he cared to admit. Victoria's company filled a void in his life he'd scarcely acknowledged. He admired her resilience, her willingness to learn, and her quiet determination to make this new life work. And if sometimes he found himself watching her a moment too long or thinking of her when he should be focusing on ranch work, well, that was his business and no one else's. One crisp October afternoon, Thomas arrived at Victoria's cabin to find her up on a ladder, picking the last of the season's apples. She waved when she saw him, her face flushed with exertion, auburn hair escaping from its pins. "You're just in time," she called. "This basket's almost full, and I can't manage it and the ladder both." Thomas dismounted and hurried to help, taking the heavy basket from her as she descended. "You should have waited for me to help with this," he chided gently. "That ladder doesn't look too steady." Victoria brushed stray hair from her face, leaving a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "I can't always be waiting for you to rescue me, Thomas. I need to manage on my own." "I know that," he said, setting the basket down. Without thinking, he reached out and wiped the smudge from her cheek with his thumb. But there's a difference between independence and foolhardiness. Victoria's breath caught at his touch, and for a moment they stood very still, his hand lingering near her face. Thomas pulled back first, clearing his throat. "I brought you something," he said, turning toward his horse. He retrieved a package from his saddlebag and handed it to her. "From Denver. Had one of my men pick it up when he was there on business." Victoria unwrapped the package to find a beautiful leather-bound journal and a set of quality pens. "Oh, Thomas," she breathed, running her fingers over the soft leather. "This is too generous." "You mentioned you were running out of writing paper," he said, looking pleased at her reaction. "Thought you might like something proper for your stories." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Victoria deeply. "Thank you, truly." They carried the apple basket inside, where Victoria had prepared a simple supper. As they ate, she told him about her recent trip to town and the gossip she'd heard about the railroad construction bringing new people to Salida. "Town's changing," Thomas acknowledged. "Some for the better, some not. More opportunities, but also more troubles." He hesitated, then added, "There's been talk of some unsavory characters hanging around the new saloon. Might be best if you didn't go to town alone for a while." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "I appreciate your concern, but I can't hide in my cabin because of rumors." "Not asking you to hide," Thomas replied. "Just be cautious, or let me know when you're planning to go in. I often have business there anyway." She studied him for a moment, recognizing the genuine concern behind his words. "Very well, I'll be careful." After supper, they sat by the fireplace, the evening having turned cool enough to warrant a small fire. Victoria showed Thomas some of her writing, something she'd never done with anyone before. He listened attentively as she read a short story she'd composed about a young girl discovering a hidden garden. "You have a gift," he said when she finished. "The way you describe things, it's like I can see them, feel them." Victoria blushed at the praise. "It's just a hobby." "No," Thomas shook his head. "It's more than that. You should send it to one of those magazines back east, the ones that publish stories." The suggestion startled her. "Do you really think it's good enough?" "I do," he said simply, and the certainty in his voice made her believe it might be possible. As Thomas prepared to leave that evening, a light rain began to fall. Victoria stood in the doorway, watching as he donned his coat and hat. "You could stay," she offered impulsively. "Until the rain passes. The spare room is made up." Thomas paused, temptation clear in his expression, but then shook his head. "Best not. People talk, and your reputation's important." "My reputation?" Victoria laughed softly. "I'm already the eccentric Easterner living alone in her uncle's cabin." "I'm not sure there's much reputation to protect." A smile touched Thomas's lips. "Even so." He stepped onto the porch, then turned back. "Victoria." "Yes." He seemed to struggle with words, then simply said, "Lock your door after I leave." She nodded, watching as he mounted his horse and rode away into the rainy darkness. Only after his figure disappeared did she close and lock the door as instructed, feeling a curious mix of disappointment and something else she wasn't quite ready to name. The following week brought the first real cold snap of the season. Victoria woke one morning to frost on her window panes and hurried to stoke the fire in the main room. She was just making coffee when a knock came at the door. Opening it, she found Thomas standing there, his breath visible in the cold air. "Thought you might need help chopping more firewood before the real cold sets in," he explained, stamping his boots to warm his feet. Victoria invited him in gratefully, pouring him coffee while he warmed himself by the fire. "You have a knack for showing up just when needed," she observed. Thomas shrugged, cradling the coffee mug in his hands. "Weather's turning. Won't be long before we get snow." They spent the morning working together, Thomas splitting logs while Victoria stacked them in the covered area beside the cabin. By noon, they had prepared a substantial woodpile that would see her through several weeks of cold weather. "Come back to the ranch with me," Thomas suggested as they finished. "Alina's been asking about you, and there's a storm brewing. You can stay the night and come back tomorrow when it passes." Victoria hesitated, looking at the darkening sky. "I should stay here, make sure everything's secure for the storm." "We can do that now," Thomas insisted. "Victoria, I don't like the thought of you here alone if this turns bad. The first winter storm can be unpredictable." Something in his tone convinced her. "All right, let me gather a few things." They secured the cabin, making sure the fire was safely out and windows were latched, then rode toward the Yates ranch with the wind picking up behind them. They arrived just as the first snowflakes began to fall, large and wet against the gray sky. Alina welcomed Victoria warmly, fussing over her cold hands and insisting she sit by the kitchen stove while the housekeeper prepared a hot meal. Thomas disappeared to see to the horses and check on his ranch hands before the storm worsened. That evening, as the wind howled outside and snow accumulated against the windows, Victoria sat in Thomas's parlor, wrapped in a quilt Alina had provided. Thomas entered with 2 mugs of something steaming and aromatic. "Hot cider with spices," he explained, handing her one. "Alina's special recipe." Victoria sipped gratefully, the warm liquid spreading through her chest. "It's delicious." Thomas settled into the chair opposite her, the firelight playing across his features. "Glad you came back with me. Storm's worse than I expected." They talked quietly as the evening progressed, the familiar rhythm of their conversation, a contrast to the wild weather outside. Victoria found herself studying Thomas's face in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his right eyebrow, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled. She had long since admitted to herself that she found him handsome, but it was more than that. There was a quality of steadfastness about him that drew her, a sense that here was a man who meant what he said and said what he meant. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, catching her gaze. Victoria felt heat rise to her cheeks, grateful for the dim light that might hide her blush. "Just that I'm fortunate to have found a friend like you. I don't know how I would have managed these past months without your help." Thomas looked down at his mug, turning it slowly in his hands. "I've been thinking about that, about us being friends." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "The truth is, Victoria, I've come to care for you as more than just a friend or neighbor." Victoria's heart quickened, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I know it hasn't been long," Thomas went on, his voice low and steady. "And I know you came out here seeking independence, not entanglement, so I've kept my feelings to myself. But tonight, with the storm and you being here—" He took a breath. "I thought perhaps I should speak plainly." "I appreciate plain speaking," Victoria said softly. "And I've come to care for you too, Thomas. Very much." The admission hung in the air between them, changing everything and nothing all at once. Thomas set his mug aside and leaned forward, his expression serious. "I'm not asking for anything right now," he said. "Just acknowledging what's between us and seeing if you might be open to exploring it further." Victoria considered his words, aware that her decision now would set a course for both their futures. "I am open to that," she said finally. "But you're right, I did come here seeking independence. I need to know that won't be lost." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I would never ask you to give up the freedom you fought for. That strength, that determination, it's part of what I admire about you." The conversation shifted then, both of them aware of the boundary they just crossed, but neither rushing to define what came next. They talked of practical things: the storm, the coming winter, the changes in Salida, but underneath ran a current of new awareness, of possibilities opening before them. When Victoria finally retired to the guest room Elena had prepared, she lay awake for some time, listening to the storm and thinking about Thomas's words. For so long, her focus had been on escaping the constrained future her parents had planned for her. She had never allowed herself to consider that she might find a different kind of partnership, one based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The storm continued through the night and into the following day, keeping Victoria at the Yates ranch longer than planned. She spent the time helping Elena in the kitchen, writing in her journal and occasionally catching Thomas's eye across the room, sharing small smiles that felt like secrets. By evening, the storm had passed, leaving a transformed landscape of pristine white. Thomas suggested they wait until morning to return to her cabin, and Victoria agreed, both of them knowing the delay was as much about extending their time together as it was about practical concerns. After supper, Thomas invited her to his study, a room she hadn't seen before. It was distinctly masculine, with a large desk, bookshelves lining one wall, and maps spread across a side table. But what caught Victoria's attention was the painting above the fireplace, a landscape of Pennsylvania farmland that seemed curiously out of place in this Colorado setting. "My childhood home," Thomas explained, noting her interest. "Margaret commissioned it for me from a photograph before." He trailed off, then cleared his throat. "It reminds me where I came from." Victoria moved closer to the painting, studying the peaceful scene. "It's beautiful. Do you miss it?" "Sometimes," Thomas admitted. "The simplicity of it mostly. Life was more straightforward there." "Yet you chose to come west," Victoria observed. Thomas nodded, moving to stand beside her. "After the war, everything felt different. And after losing Margaret and James, I needed something completely new. This land harsh as it can be offered that. The mention of his late wife and son brought a question to Victoria's mind, one she'd been hesitant to ask. Do you think, would Margaret approve, of your feelings for me, I mean? Thomas looked surprised, then thoughtful. Yes, he said finally. She was practical, Margaret was. She'd not want me alone forever. He smiled slightly. She'd like you, I think, your spirit. The answer touched Victoria deeply. She reached out and took his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. Thank you for sharing this with me, your home, your memories. Thomas's gaze held hers, and for a moment Victoria thought he might kiss her. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently and said, "Thank you for listening." The next morning, Thomas drove Victoria back to her cabin in a small sleigh, the snow still too deep for horses alone. The journey was magical, gliding through the pristine whiteness, the only sounds the runners on snow and the occasional jingle of the harness bells. Victoria's cabin appeared untouched by the storm, the woodpile she and Thomas had stacked still secure under its shelter. Inside, the cabin was cold but undamaged. Thomas built a fire while Victoria checked her stores and found everything as she'd left it. "I'll need to visit town soon," she remarked, taking inventory of her supplies. "I'm running low on flour and coffee." "I can bring you some from the ranch," Thomas offered, feeding another log to the growing fire. Victoria shook her head. "Thank you, but I should go myself. I promised Mrs. Jenkins I'd attend her quilting circle this week, and I have letters to post." Thomas nodded, understanding her need for independence even as concern showed in his expression. "The trail should be clear enough by tomorrow or the next day. I could escort you." "That would be nice," Victoria agreed, surprising herself with how easily she accepted his offer. Before, she might have insisted on going alone to prove her capability. Now, she recognized that accepting help didn't diminish her independence. It was simply the way of life out here, as Thomas had once explained. As the cabin warmed, they settled into the familiar routine of making coffee and talking about the practicalities of winter on the frontier. Thomas shared advice about preventing pipes from freezing and how to spot signs of roof stress from heavy snow. When it came time for him to leave, they stood in the doorway, reluctant to part. "Will you be all right here tonight?" Thomas asked, concern evident in his voice. Victoria nodded, touched by his worry. "I'll be fine. The fire's going strong and I have plenty of blankets." Thomas hesitated, then slowly reached out to touch her cheek, his fingers gentle against her skin. "I'll come tomorrow, help you clear a path to the barn." "I would appreciate that," she said softly, aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth of his hand against her face. This time, when Thomas leaned forward, he didn't pull back. His lips met hers in a kiss so gentle it was almost reverent, a question as much as an affirmation. Victoria answered by stepping closer, her hand coming to rest on his chest as she returned the kiss with equal gentleness. When they parted, Thomas's eyes searched hers, looking for any sign of regret or uncertainty. Finding none, a smile spread across his face, the most unguarded expression she'd seen from him. "Tomorrow, then," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "Tomorrow," Victoria agreed, unable to suppress her own smile. As she watched him drive away in the sleigh, Victoria touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the impression of his kiss. For the first time since arriving in Colorado, she felt not just independent, but truly at home. The winter months brought a new rhythm to Victoria's life. The harsh Colorado weather made travel difficult, forcing a certain isolation, but Thomas visited regularly, often staying for meals or to help with tasks too difficult for Victoria to manage alone. Their relationship deepened gradually, built on conversations by the fire, shared work, and an increasing physical awareness that expressed itself in lingering touches and kisses that grew more passionate with time. Victoria continued to write, filling her new journal with stories inspired by her experiences. To her surprise and delight, a magazine in Boston accepted one of her tales, a story about a woman finding unexpected strength in the aftermath of loss. The small payment that accompanied the acceptance letter felt like validation of her new path. When she shared the news with Thomas, his pride in her accomplishment was evident. "I knew your writing was special," he said, lifting her into an impulsive embrace that left them both laughing. "This calls for a celebration." That weekend, he took her to dinner at Salida's new hotel restaurant, the finest establishment in town, though modest by St. Louis standards. Victoria wore her best dress, and Thomas appeared in a proper suit that made him look surprisingly formal. "You clean up well, Mr. Yates," she teased as he helped her from the sleigh. "Don't get used to it," he replied with a wink. "Can't run a ranch in fancy clothes." The evening was magical, the food excellent, the attention from Thomas flattering, and the curious glances from other diners easily ignored. By now, most of Salida had drawn their own conclusions about the relationship between Thomas Yates and Old Bill's niece, but Victoria found she cared little for gossip. She had earned her place in this community through her own efforts, and her personal choices were her own to make. As they drove back to her cabin under a canopy of winter stars, Thomas seemed unusually quiet. Victoria waited, sensing he had something on his mind. "I've been thinking," he finally said, his eyes on the snowy road ahead. "About the future." Victoria's heart quickened. "Oh. This winter has been different, better." He glanced at her briefly. "Having you in my life has changed things, Victoria, made me see possibilities I thought were closed to me." "I feel the same," she said softly. "You've become very important to me, Thomas." He nodded, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I'm not rushing you. I know your independence matters, but I wanted you to know that I'm thinking long-term about us." His hands tightened on the reins. "If that's something you might consider too." The implication was clear, even without a formal proposal. Victoria considered her response carefully, aware of the weight of this moment. "I came west seeking freedom," she said slowly. "Freedom from expectations, from a life others had planned for me. What I've found with you is different. You don't seek to constrain me, you help me grow." She placed her hand on his arm. "So yes, Thomas, I would consider a future with you, very seriously." The relief and joy that spread across his face told her all she needed to know about the depth of his feelings. He brought the sleigh to a stop, turned to her, and kissed her with an intensity that left her breathless. "I'm not asking yet," he murmured against her lips. "When I do, it will be proper, but I needed to know we were walking the same path." Victoria smiled, her heart full. "We are." As winter gave way to spring, Victoria's life expanded in new ways. Her writing continued to find modest success, with 2 more stories accepted for publication. Her apple orchard bloomed magnificently, promising a bountiful harvest later in the year. And her relationship with Thomas deepened, becoming a cornerstone of her life, while still allowing her the independence she valued. They fell into comfortable patterns. Thomas would spend 2 or 3 evenings a week at her cabin, sometimes staying for supper, sometimes just sitting with her while she wrote or read aloud to him. On Sundays, they attended church together, then often spent the afternoon at his ranch, where Alina treated Victoria like family. The townsfolk now greeted them as a couple, and Victoria had been accepted into the social circles of Salida, invited to quilting bees, socials, and community events. She had even started teaching reading to several of the town's children one afternoon a week, finding unexpected joy in sharing her love of literature with young minds. One warm May evening, Thomas arrived at her cabin with a mysterious invitation. "Ride with me," he said, offering no explanation. "There's something I want to show you." Intrigued, Victoria saddled her mare and followed him along a trail that led up into the foothills above her property. They rode for nearly an hour, climbing steadily until they reached a small plateau overlooking the valley. Below them stretched a panoramic view of Salida, the surrounding ranches and the distant mountains, all bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. "It's breathtaking," Victoria said, dismounting to stand at the edge of the overlook. "I discovered this place my first year here," Thomas explained, joining her. "I come sometimes to think, to get perspective." They stood in silence for a moment, taking in the beauty of the landscape. Then Thomas turned to her, his expression serious. "Victoria, I brought you here because this place represents something to me, a vision of possibility. When I first found it, I was still grieving, still trying to figure out if I could build a new life here." He took her hands in his. "Now I know I can, with you." Victoria's breath caught as Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a ring, a simple but elegant gold band set with a single diamond. "I promised I'd do this properly," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion Victoria could see in his eyes. "Victoria Pierce, you came into my life when I least expected it but most needed it. You've brought light back to places that were dark for too long." He took a deep breath. "I love you. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Victoria's eyes as she looked at this man who had become so central to her world, this man who respected her dreams even as he shared his own. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Thomas, I love you and I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that promised a lifetime of shared moments. When they finally parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I was thinking a June wedding," he suggested, "if that's not too soon." Victoria laughed, joy bubbling through her. June would be perfect. As they rode back down the trail, the first stars appearing in the twilight sky, Victoria felt a sense of rightness settle over her. The journey that had begun with her desperate flight from St. Louis continued through her collapse on the trail, and Thomas's timely rescue had led her not just to independence, but to a partnership that enhanced rather than diminished her newfound strength. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Salida. Alina was ecstatic, immediately beginning preparations for what she insisted would be the finest wedding the territory has seen. The townspeople offered congratulations and support, many expressing that they'd seen this coming from the day Thomas had brought the unconscious Eastern lady to his ranch. Victoria wrote to her parents, a letter that was both an announcement of her engagement and a gentle closure of the rift that had formed between them. She described her life now, her writing, her orchard, the community she'd become part of, and most importantly, the man she had chosen to marry. Whether they would respond or attend the wedding remained uncertain, but Victoria felt she had extended the olive branch as far as she could. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Thomas and Victoria made plans for their future. They decided that Victoria would keep her cabin and property. "Your independence is important, and besides, that orchard is too valuable to neglect," Thomas insisted. But she would live primarily at the ranch, using the cabin as a writing retreat and overseeing the orchard's management. The wedding took place on a perfect June day in Salida's small church. Victoria wore a gown of ivory satin ordered from Denver, with her uncle's favorite roses in her bouquet. Thomas, looking handsome but slightly uncomfortable in his formal attire, waited for her at the altar with an expression of such open adoration that several of the town's older women were seen dabbing at their eyes before the ceremony even began. Alina had outdone herself with the preparations, transforming the churchyard into a celebration space with flowers, ribbons, and tables laden with food. The entire town seemed to attend, along with ranchers from the surrounding areas, and even a few travelers who happened to be passing through. To Victoria's surprise and joy, a response to her letter had arrived just days before the wedding, not from her parents, but from her younger sister Caroline, who appeared unannounced on the morning of the ceremony with tales of having secretly boarded a train west against their parents' wishes. "They're being impossible," Caroline explained as she helped Victoria prepare. "But I couldn't miss my sister's wedding, especially to this cowboy who rescued you from certain death on the trail. It's all terribly romantic." Victoria laughed, embracing her sister tightly. "Oh, Caroline, I've missed you, and it wasn't quite as dramatic as all that." "Well, it should have been," Caroline replied with a grin. "That's how I'll tell it anyway." The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, with vows that spoke of partnership, respect, and enduring love. When Thomas placed the gold band on Victoria's finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady but his eyes betrayed the depth of his emotion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, and the church erupted in cheers as Thomas pulled Victoria into a kiss that managed to be both proper enough for public viewing and passionate enough to bring a blush to her cheeks. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed twice the number of guests. Victoria found herself overwhelmed at times by the genuine affection shown by this community that had become her own in less than a year. "Happy, Mrs. Yates?" Thomas asked quietly as they shared a moment alone amidst the festivities. Victoria smiled at the new name, testing how it felt. "Very happy, Mr. Yates, though I might still use Pierce for my writing." Thomas nodded, completely understanding. "As you should. Your talent is your own." As the evening ended and they prepared to leave for the hotel in town where they would spend their first night as husband and wife, Alina approached with a small package. "A wedding gift," she explained, pressing it into Victoria's hands. "From all of us at the ranch." Victoria unwrapped it to find a beautiful silver pen and inkwell set, engraved with her initials VP rather than her new married ones. "Thomas said you would prefer it this way," Alina explained, her eyes twinkling. "For your stories." Tears threatened as Victoria hugged the housekeeper. "It's perfect, thank you." Later, in the privacy of their hotel room, Victoria shared her emotions with Thomas. "Your understanding of what matters to me, my writing, my independence, it means everything." Thomas drew her into his arms, his expression serious. "I don't want to change who you are, Victoria. I fell in love with your spirit, your determination. I just want to share my life with you, walk beside you." "As I want to walk beside you," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. "Partners in all things." What followed was a night of tenderness and passion, as they discovered each other in new ways, no longer restrained by propriety or uncertainty, but united in their commitment to each other and the life they would build together. The years that followed brought changes and growth to both their lives. Victoria's writing gained increasing recognition, with her stories appearing regularly in several prominent magazines. She eventually compiled them into a book, Frontier Tales, which found modest success and earned her a small but dedicated readership. Thomas's ranch prospered under his careful management, expanding to become one of the most successful operations in the area. With the railroad's arrival, Salida grew, bringing new opportunities and challenges to the community. In their second year of marriage, Victoria gave birth to a son they named William Thomas, after her uncle and his father. The boy grew to be a sturdy child with his mother's auburn hair and his father's steady temperament. 3 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Margaret Alina, completing their family. Victoria continued to use her cabin as a writing retreat, sometimes spending days there when inspiration struck particularly hard. Thomas never questioned this need for occasional solitude, understanding it was integral to who she was. Instead, he would bring the children to visit her for picnic lunches, creating a balance that honored both her independence and their family bonds. The orchard thrived under their joint care, becoming known throughout the region for its exceptional apples. They expanded it gradually, adding new varieties and experimenting with different cultivation techniques Thomas researched during the winter months. Caroline, who had stayed on after the wedding, eventually married a young lawyer who set up practice in Salida, giving Victoria the joy of having family nearby. Their parents, though never fully reconciled to Victoria's choices, did visit once after William's birth, a tense but ultimately healing encounter that opened the door to occasional correspondence. 10 years after their wedding, Thomas and Victoria stood once again on the plateau overlooking the valley, this time with their children, now 7 and 4, exploring nearby under Alina's watchful eye. "Remember when you proposed here?" Victoria asked, leaning against Thomas's shoulder. He nodded, his arm around her waist. "Best decision I ever made." Victoria looked out over the landscape, so familiar now yet still capable of taking her breath away with its beauty. "When I collapsed on that trail, I thought my dream of independence was ending before it began. I never imagined it was actually the beginning of something far better." Thomas turned to face her, his eyes still holding the same warmth they had when he'd first told her he loved her. "Not what either of us expected, was it?" "No," Victoria agreed, reaching up to touch his face, now bearing a few more lines but still as dear to her as ever. "So much better." As they gathered their children and headed back down the trail toward home, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought her here from the desperate young woman fleeing an unwanted marriage to the writer, wife, mother, and community member she had become. It hadn't been an easy path, but every step, even the one that had led to her collapse under the merciless sun, had been necessary to bring her to this life she had built with Thomas, a life of love, purpose, and true partnership. The sun was setting as they reached the ranch, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold. William ran ahead, eager to tell Alina about the rabbit they had spotted on the trail, while Margaret rode proudly on her father's shoulders, chattering about the flowers she had collected. Thomas caught Victoria's eye over their daughter's excited gestures, sharing a smile that held a decade of memories and the promise of many more to come. In that moment, Victoria knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just independence, but something far more precious, a love that strengthened rather than diminished her, a partner who walked beside her rather than ahead or behind, and a life richer and more fulfilling than any she could have imagined when she first set out on that dusty trail west. And it had all begun with a moment of weakness, a collapse from heatstroke, and a cowboy who had poured water on her and made shade simple acts of kindness that had changed the course of both their lives forever.